So, America, it's no secret, I think, among anybody that watches my videos that I have had a fascination with this country all my life, virtually, I think, or at least as far back as I can remember. And I've done plenty of videos so far on the things that have sort of influenced that. So I've done, the TV shows that influenced it, films that have influenced it, even coffee influenced. No, it was the other way around. America influenced my love of coffee, but that's another story entirely. I actually need coffee as we speak, but of course there have been people that have highly influenced my love of this country, people that I know that are parts of my life, relatives, friends, and all of that, as well as people that I've been watching from afar, not spying on, that would be creepy. I'm talking about famous people, writers, authors, that kind of thing. Writers and authors tend to be the same thing. And so this video is about that. 5 people that have turned me on to America. That it is important I say that last part. Bill BRYSON, somebody that I've been reading since the late 90s. I think I even studied one of his books in college. That one was Notes from a Small Island. And anybody that doesn't know Bill BRYSON, I mean, most of us don't know him personally. But those of us that do, I don't, that's not me. If you don't know who Bill BRYSON is, let me tell you, he is an American writer, a travel writer, who has spent a lot of his time writing about his life in England. He moved over there some time ago. I think he lives there to this day, but there was a short period where he came back to the United States, and he wrote a book about that, and that book was called Notes from a Big Country, or as maybe known to some of you as I'm a Stranger Here Myself. And it was very interesting to see, I think, the viewpoint of somebody that had lived a life elsewhere and come back to the United States, because it sort of, even before I moved here, gave me that kind of outsider's perspective on this country that I had myself. I'd not yet moved here, but it was through the use of humorous anecdote, and I should say that he is quite a dry humorist in the way he writes. It sort of opened my eyes up to some of the smaller aspects of day-to-day life that I might expect moving here. And he passes sort of humorous commentary on those things, like the size of things. It's not just the country that's big, it is the size of vehicles, the size of food. And I often find that persuasive writing is often best done through the use of comedy, or at least that's something I've been taught to believe. And Bill BRYSON, Mr. BRYSON, does very well at that. But there's one author on the other end of the writing genre spectrum. That would be on the horror writing genre spectrum. I can't speak today. I know, I've told you, I need to go see a therapist, I think. But I probably needed to see a therapist about my love of this next writer, because I was into him at the age of 9. Into his writing, not him. I don't know him. Stephen King, and I don't know, Mum, if you're aware that I was reading horror novels at the age of 9, but I was. I was reading all of them. Not all of them, that's a lot of words, but a lot of them. Mostly the ones that were made into films, because that way it was just easier to understand what I was reading. The Shining, Misery, It. Now, you might be thinking, why does that influence your love of America? You don't see this country, do you, as a breeding ground for killer clowns? Well, no, not quite. Although there have been elements of that. I remember about 2 years ago when clowns were showing up in the woods near me and near other people. It's horrifying, but that's another story entirely. It wasn't about the supernatural events in these books, of course, that turned me onto it, but it was the backdrops themselves. He set a lot of his books in Maine, a place that I've had the good fortune to visit. I even saw a pet cemetery once, and it was very sad because you learned that it wasn't curiosity that killed the cat. It was a Range Rover. And so, yeah, a lot of them set in Maine. Of course, though, with the exceptions of some of his books, such as The Shining, Misery, those are set out in Colorado. Now, in the case of Misery, right, let's pretend I'm Paul Sheldon, if you've ever read the book or seen the film with James Caan and Kathy Bates, then you'll realize that he has quite a harrowing 2 hours, or that at least in the format of the film, probably a number of days in terms of the story itself, in which he is, well, taken hostage, essentially, in the house of this nurse. That's not the part that I find romantic. You know, I don't want my leg knocked off. But the idea of being a writer somewhere in the mountains in Colorado, just tucked away, isolated from the rest of the world to finish all of my books, sounds very inviting. Now, that's not to say you can't do that sort of thing in England. Of course, the Lake District is a very peaceful, isolated place, one that stereotypically draws the writers in because it's opium capital of England, or at least was, I suppose, back when Wordsworth was writing, although he didn't partake of it. I'm getting sidetracked here, but Stephen King set his stories obviously in quite lived-in places, and it wasn't always in these sort of isolated, desolate areas, although of course that does lend itself somewhat to the horror that he writes, but also to American suburbia in the likes of It and all of that. Now, once again, I'm not seeking out creepy clowns, who is, but it did sort of evoked those images that films like E.T. and The Goonies did of kids riding around on bicycles. I think when I was a child, that would have been very appealing, to just get on a BMX, ride off into the sunset and find an alien. And speaking of aliens, America had one of its own. My sincerest apologies to the Armstrong family. I did not mean to insinuate that Neil is an alien. Though he has visited an alien world, if that's what you consider the moon. Doctor Who certainly did. It thought it was an egg. You might think this is a sort of odd choice for this particular list, but it's not really. Anybody that knows me, and knows me deeply, knows that I have a big fascination with space, and particularly the 1960s space race. And Neil Armstrong, of course, with his first steps on the moon, I think became the face of that space race. This should be a poem. He didn't become the face, actually. His helmet did. Now, what I should point out, I mean, I was born just 12 years after the moon landing, so it's still quite fresh, really, in terms of human history. And it just blew my mind to think that somebody put their feet down on that globe that was 250,000 miles from Earth, that I could see every night in the sky. Not every night, it's usually cloudy in England, but, most nights when that dispersed. It was unbelievable and unfathomable to me. And when I really stopped to think about it, it still is. And it really speaks to American ingenuity. In the last 100 years, this country has achieved so much from a technological standpoint. Now, you could say that he didn't choose to go to the moon, that NASA chose him. So I should really choose NASA in this situation. But NASA's not a person. It's a government agency. But moving on to somebody who's a bit more down to earth. That was a pun. And somebody a bit closer to home, that works as well. That brings us on to our penultimate entry. Now, you might be thinking that Tara, my wife, is an obvious choice for this list, because it is, frankly. She's American, obviously, and I met her in England. And at the time, I think it was, we met in 2005. I didn't move here until 2008. So it was a good 3 years where I was still in England, but, either married to Tara or in a relationship with her. And so conversations would come up about America, of course, all the time. And one of the things that stands out to me is Tara telling me about the harsh winters in the Midwest, and me not quite believing what she was telling me, that, it would get well below zero, that snow would come up yay high, or maybe even yay high, depends on how tall I'm sitting down. I'm currently 4 foot. And I didn't believe that, not until, of course, I moved to the US, and ever since I've seen it firsthand. Her interest in history knows no bounds. She was previously a historical interpreter, and she can tell me a lot, specifically about 19th century living, and has done. And it turns out as well that her family going back is related to it's either the Hatfields or the McCoys. She's going to set me straight, but she's not here right now. Are you? No. So I often talk to her off camera. Pretend to. For anybody that doesn't know, that was two warring families that existed in sort of the West Virginia area and thereabouts in the 19th century. And Tara comes from that, and it's not hard to see where she gets her combustible elements. I'm joking, if you're watching. And then, of course, to this very day, she joins me on most of these trips around America. So now we're getting to see it through each other's eyes, and she helps to explain some of the oddities that I encounter. And just to backtrack a little bit, of course, it was Tara, or at least interactions with her, that I was able to uncover a lot of these sort of strange Americanisms in the language that I've dealt with on things like distant words. Now, these were obviously just observational, but it was those early conversations that I think inspired me to go on and just look a little deeper at where these words come from and why they came about. And so it goes without saying that I would put Tara ahead of Bill Bryson, Stephen King, and Neil Armstrong in all facets of life, never mind just this list. So if that doesn't win me brownie points, nothing will. And on the subject of family members, let's finish this off with the very person that got me into Bill Bryson. So my dad is always quick to remind me that if you ever need useless trivia, he's your man. But it's not entirely useless at all, I would say. Firstly, he organized the trip to Florida in 1990 when I was 8 years old. That was an eye-opening experience. I think it convinced me fully that America was entirely beaches and palm trees, which I've come to debunk in later life. But more than that, my dad took an interest in the 50 states and their capitals when I was a kid, and often you're like a sponge at that age. You soak in certain elements of your parents, and that was one of the things that I clinged on to. So hearing my dad sort of talk about all of them got me wildly interested in them, to the point that I eventually took out this book from the library, as I've spoken about before, and developed that sort of encyclopedic interest in the US, which was kind of the foundation, I suppose, for the interest that I would later have with my Finding America series. And occasionally, when he gets a crossword clue that pertains to one of the states or just the US in general, I think he likes to ask me them to see if I know the answer. And thankfully, thanks actually to you, Dad, I do know the answer most of the time now. So thank you for that. So that's it. That is my list of 5 people that turned me on to America. Stay tuned, though, because in a few weeks I will be doing 5 books that turned me on to America. But in the meantime, it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from Tara. She's not here. I'm lying. Thank you for watching this episode of Lost in the Pond. Don't forget to hit my stupid little face to subscribe, and please share this video with the world. Hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and if you would like to support this channel, please do so at patreon.com/lostinthepond.